She was never supposed to matter. An orphaned Omega with no pack, no name worth remembering, no future worth protecting, she was the kingdom's forgotten footnote. And yet, on the night the great King Aldrich collapsed with his soul literally fracturing apart, she was the only one who stayed. Everyone else ran. She knelt. What followed was a healing ritual so ancient, so violent in its intimacy, that it should have killed them both. Her life force poured into his broken spirit like fire into a cracked vessel, and somewhere in that sacred, devastating exchange, something shifted. Something that cannot be undone. He woke up whole. He woke up changed. And now? He won't let her leave. Not a request. Not a suggestion. A king's absolute, terrifying command wrapped in silk sheets and golden chains and a hunger in his eyes that no crown can contain. She saved his life. So now he has decided her life belongs to him. The High Council is furious. The ancient laws are clear. But the king? The king has stopped caring about laws. This is the story of a debt that became a devotion and a cage that feels dangerously close to love. If slow burn obsession, forbidden desire, and a king who will burn his kingdom down before releasing the woman who rebuilt his soul sounds like your kind of story, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because this one? It does not cool down. Chapter 1. The Last Resort. The candles had been burning for 3 days straight. Not because anyone found them romantic. Because the royal physicians refused to work in the dark while a king died in front of them, and dying, truly and irreversibly, was exactly what Aldrich was doing. His breath came in shallow, rattling intervals. His massive frame, the same body that had once split a war table in half with one blow, now lay trembling beneath silk sheets soaked through with cold sweat. The greatest shifter king in 4 centuries was dissolving from the inside out, his soul fracturing along fault lines that no healer in the kingdom had the language to describe, let alone repair. They had tried everything. Bloodroot tonics. Lunar binding. 3 of the elder healers had pressed their hands to his chest simultaneously and pulled back screaming. Whatever was destroying him was not a poison. It was not a curse in any traditional sense. It was deeper than that, cellular, spiritual, a kind of unraveling that happened when a soul had been pushed past its breaking point for too long and simply began to come apart at the seams. The king's chambers smelled of burned sage and desperation. Junior physicians whispered in corners. Senior ones stood at the foot of the bed with their hands clasped and their eyes averted, doing what learned men always do when they have run out of answers. They performed the appearance of calm. They shuffled parchments. They spoke in technical language about symptoms they could not explain. They looked busy so no one would ask them if he was going to survive. He was not, and they all knew it. The High Council stood at the edges of the chamber like well-dressed ravens, already calculating succession. And then someone mentioned the girl. Nobody said her name with any reverence. It was more of a last resort, spoken the way you mention an ugly option you have been avoiding, quietly, reluctantly, with a grimace. An orphaned Omega. No pack affiliation. No bloodline worth recording. She had been living in the lower quarters of the palace for the past 2 years, technically employed as a kitchen auxiliary, practically invisible to everyone above the 3rd floor. The only reason her name surfaced at all was because old physician Bran had found an obscure notation in a pre-dynasty healing text, a soul-mending ritual so ancient it had been deliberately removed from the official archives. The ceremony required a vessel of extraordinarily rare energetic compatibility. Someone whose own soul signature was, by some cosmic accident, almost perfectly matched to the fracturing one. They had tested the entire court. She was the only match. Chapter 2. The Ritual. When they brought her to the chamber, she looked exactly like what she was, a young woman who had spent her whole life being told she was nobody, wearing that identity so completely it had become a kind of armor. She stood at the threshold of the king's rooms and took in the gathered nobility, the dying monarch, the desperate faces of men who held all the power in the known world and were currently useless, and she did not flinch. Not because she was brave. Because she had learned very early that flinching attracted attention, and attention, in her experience, had never once been kind. Old Bran explained the ritual to her in clipped, clinical terms. She would need to make direct contact. Both hands, sternum to sternum, her life force deliberately opened and extended like a bridge into his fracturing soul. The ceremony would allow her energy to locate the broken places and essentially pour itself in, holding the cracks together long enough for his own biology to remember how to heal. The risk to her was significant. Energetic depletion of that magnitude could leave her catatonic, could damage her own soul structure permanently, could, in the worst documented historical case, kill her outright. She asked exactly one question. Will it save him? Bran said it was the only thing that might. She walked to the bed. What happened next was not witnessed clearly by anyone in that chamber, because approximately 4 seconds after she placed her hands on the king's chest, every candle in the room blew out simultaneously, and the air pressure dropped so sharply that 2 of the junior physicians stumbled. Those closest to the bed would later describe what they felt rather than what they saw, a heat that had no visible source, a sound like the lowest possible note of a cello played at enormous volume, and the overwhelming, irrational sensation that something enormous was happening in a dimension just slightly to the left of the visible world. She felt him the moment contact was made. Not his body, his soul. It was vast, and it was broken, and it was in a level of pain that had no equivalent in the physical world. Old pain, compounded grief. The specific internal devastation of a man who had carried impossible weight alone for so long that the carrying had become indistinguishable from the wound itself. She had expected to find a king in there. She found something far more unguarded than that. Something raw and enormous and exhausted in the specific way of a creature that has been strong for everyone for so long it has forgotten it is also allowed to break. She poured herself toward the fractures without thinking. It was instinct, the same instinct that had always made her patch things, fix things, quietly mend what others walked past. Her energy moved through the broken architecture of his soul like warm light through cold glass, finding every crack, pressing in, holding the edges together with a tenderness that was entirely involuntary and entirely irreversible. He grabbed her wrist. Not consciously. His body was still technically unconscious. But something in him, the raw, animal core of him, felt the warmth coming in and seized it with the blind desperation of a drowning man finding a rope in the dark. His grip was iron. His soul pulled at hers in a way that made her gasp out loud. And for one suspended, impossible moment, they were not two separate people. She felt his memories like weather. He felt her steadiness like shelter. When the candles relit, spontaneously, all at once, she was slumped sideways across the edge of the bed, exhausted in a way that went down to the marrow. His color had returned. His breathing was deep and even. The fractures in his soul were sealed. And his hand, even now, even in unconscious sleep, had not released her wrist. Chapter 3. The King Reborn. His recovery defied every projection the physicians had constructed. By the following morning, Aldrich was sitting upright. By the afternoon, he had dismissed the medical staff entirely. By the next dawn, he had shifted fully, something his deteriorating soul had prevented for weeks, and the transformation was violent and absolute, the wolf massive and dark and relentlessly, terrifyingly healthy. The guards outside the chamber reported that the sound of it had rattled the stone walls. There was a moment, early in that first morning, when Bran had dared to approach the bedside with a tonic, a precautionary supplement, standard post-ritual protocol, and Aldrich had looked at the old physician with eyes that were still half-wolf, still burning with the residual fire of the shift, and had said nothing. Had simply looked. And Bran, who had served 4 monarchs and been afraid of precisely none of them, had quietly set the tonic down and taken 3 steps back, without being asked. Something had changed in the king's eyes. Everyone who saw him that morning noted it, though none of them could agree on the precise nature of the change. He was still controlled. still deliberate. But there was a new quality to his attention, a focus that had previously been distributed across the thousand concerns of governing a kingdom and was now, visibly, oriented towards something specific. The High Council exhaled collectively. The crisis was over. Except that it wasn't. It was, in fact, only beginning. Chapter 4. Before the kingdom, there was her. The psychological transformation was subtler than the physical one, but infinitely more alarming to those paying attention. The king who had re-emerged from that chamber was not the same man who had entered it. Aldrich had always been stoic to the point of coldness, a quality his advisors had long considered an asset in a ruler. He had governed through calculated detachment, treating even his closest allies with a measured, professional distance. Emotion, in his court, had always been a private language he simply refused to speak. That ended the morning after the ritual. He asked about the girl before he asked about the kingdom. His chief advisor, Lord Casson, had entered with a full political briefing prepared: border disputes, trade negotiations, 3 matters requiring immediate royal decree. The king had listened to approximately 40 seconds of it before interrupting to ask where the Omega was, whether she had eaten, and why she had not yet been brought to him. Casson had blinked. "Sire, she has been returned to the lower quarters to rest. The medical staff confirms she is recovering well. Bring her here. The physicians believe she requires. Bring her here." There was something in his voice that was new. Not louder than before. Not angrier, exactly. But denser, a weight behind it that his advisors would struggle to name for weeks until one of the older ones finally found the right word in private, over wine, spoken quietly enough not to be overheard. Territorial. Casson had delivered the rest of his briefing to a king who heard every word and responded to every question correctly and completely, and whose eyes kept moving, involuntarily, to the door, as though some part of him was listening for a particular set of footsteps in the corridor outside, as though the room was slightly wrong until she was in it. Chapter 5. The Golden Cage. She was in the middle of gathering the few belongings she owned into a cloth bag, preparing, as she had always prepared after any significant event, to disappear back into invisibility, when the king's personal guard filled the doorway of her small room. 4 of them. The royal seal on their armor catching the low light. The captain delivered his message with the flat, rehearsed neutrality of a man who had long ago learned not to editorialize the king's orders. She was requested in the upper chambers. She left her bag on the bed. She followed them. She told herself it would be brief, a formal acknowledgement, perhaps, the kind of obligatory royal courtesy extended to those who had performed a significant service. She would curtsy. He would nod. She would be dismissed. She did not come back to that room for a very long time. The decree arrived 3 days later, written in formal court language that wrapped something utterly unprecedented in the dry vocabulary of medical protocol. The Omega was to be relocated to the east wing of the royal apartments. For observation purposes. Given the experimental nature of the soul-mending ritual, continued proximity was required for ongoing assessment of possible energetic residuals in the king's recovered soul structure. The duration was listed as indefinite. The East Wing, where visiting dignitaries stayed, where the walls held tapestries older than the kingdom's current name, where the bed in the prepared room was larger than her entire previous living space, draped in deep blue silk that probably cost more than she had earned in 2 collective years of palace employment. She stood in the center of that room and understood, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, that this was not medical observation. This was something else entirely. She could feel the edges of it even before she fully understood its shape, the way the guards positioned outside her door faced inward as often as they faced out. The way every request she made was accommodated immediately and completely, with the specific, suffocating thoroughness of someone ensuring she had absolutely no reason to want to leave. Food from the royal kitchen. Access to the private gardens. 3 healers assigned exclusively to her recovery, who arrived each morning and reported. She understood this now, not to the medical wing, but directly to him. She walked the perimeter of the East Wing the way a person walks a new enclosure, not anxiously, but methodically, the way someone who has learned to map their environment takes stock of a new space. The gardens were beautiful. The library attached to her apartments held more books than she had ever seen in one room. Every physical comfort had been anticipated and provided before she thought to want it. It was the most elegant trap she had ever seen. And she had spent enough of her life in less elegant ones to recognize the structure immediately. Chapter 6. Evening Rituals. The king himself came each evening. He did not announce these visits. There was no formal protocol for them, because there was no official precedent for a reigning monarch spending his evenings in the private apartments of an unranked orphan Omega. He simply appeared, after the last council meeting had adjourned, after the official day had closed, and he sat in the chair across from her with a cup of something dark and warm, and he looked at her with an attention so complete it had a physical quality. Like pressure. Like heat from a source you could not locate. He asked her questions. Small ones at first. What she had eaten. Whether the healers had been adequate. Whether the room was comfortable. She answered carefully, briefly, with the instinctive economy of someone who has never in their life been asked enough questions to develop the habit of expansive answers. He listened to every word as though she were delivering state intelligence. And when she finished answering, he did not leave. He simply stayed, in that chair, in a silence that was somehow more demanding than conversation, a silence that expected to be sat with, inhabited, shared. It was the most disorienting experience of her life. More disorienting, in some ways, than the ritual itself. Because the ritual she had understood. Pain and purpose. Cost and outcome. Those were structures she knew how to move through. This had no structure she recognized. He had no name for it either. He would not have admitted that to anyone, but it was true. He had no vocabulary for what had happened to him inside that ceremony. He only knew that in the fractured dark of his own dissolving soul, something had found him. Something steady and quiet and completely without agenda. It had poured warmth into the coldest parts of him without asking anything in return, and it had felt, for the first and only time in his adult life, like being known. Actually known. Not the king. Not the title. The thing underneath all of it that he had buried so efficiently even he had mostly forgotten it was there. And now that thing had a face. She had a way of sitting still that undid him completely. She did not perform calm the way courtiers performed calm, with careful posture and deliberate expressions. Her stillness was genuine, the stillness of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible and had accidentally become extraordinarily good at being present in that small space. He found himself watching her hands when she wasn't looking. He found himself tracking her breathing. He found himself, one evening, reaching across the small table between them to move a strand of hair from her face and catching himself mid-motion, pulling his hand back, saying nothing, feeling the want of it sitting in his chest like an ember. She had seen him reach. She had not moved away. Neither of them mentioned it. The evenings began to stretch longer. What had started as 30-minute check-ins stressed as medical supervision quietly became something else entirely. 2 hours. 3. The fire burning low while outside the palace the kingdom continued its business without its king, who had apparently decided that the most important thing happening in the entire realm was whatever was occurring in this small room between the two of them. Chapter 7. The Council's Warning. Lord Casson brought the High Council's formal concern to the king's attention on a cold Tuesday morning with the careful phrasing of a man delivering something unpleasant to someone with the power to end his career. The council's position was respectful but unambiguous. The Omega's continued residence in the royal apartments was irregular. The ancient hierarchical laws were clear about inter-rank associations at the royal level. The bloodline protocols existed for reasons that transcended personal attachment. There were, the council wished to respectfully note, 3 noble women of appropriate rank who had expressed interest in. The king stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply rose to his full height and looked at Cassin with eyes that had gone very flat and very still, and said, in a tone of absolute, glacial finality, that the High Council's concern had been received and noted, and that if any member of that council took any action at all, to interfere with arrangements he had personally decreed, he would dissolve the council entirely and govern without one. Then he sat back down and asked Cassin to continue with the remainder of the briefing. 2 days later, a minor lord who had made the social error of suggesting, at a dinner the Omega had not attended, that the king's attachment to his little healer was an amusing but temporary distraction, found himself reassigned to a border garrison so remote it did not appear on standard military maps. The dismissal was delivered without explanation. None was needed. The message required no translation. Word spread the way bad news always does in a court, fast, quiet, and thorough. Within a week, the king's Omega had become the topic no one discussed openly and everyone discussed privately. She was the third rail of palace conversation. You did not touch it. You did not look at it directly. You certainly did not, under any circumstances, suggest within earshot of anyone connected to the king that her presence was anything other than entirely appropriate and fully welcome. The court adapted, as courts always do. They rearranged themselves around the new reality with the elegant, practiced flexibility of people whose survival has always depended on reading the room correctly. The Omega was referred to in official correspondence only and carefully as the king's personal ward. The phrasing was legally ambiguous enough to avoid triggering the bloodline protocols directly, just specific enough to make her untouchable. Chapter 8. The pull she cannot name. She heard about it. She heard about most of it, in the quiet accumulating way that palace walls talk when they think you are not listening. She heard about the council's objections. She heard about the dismissed lord. She heard the whispered count, growing weekly, of the people who had been quietly, ruthlessly excised from the king's inner circle for the crime of expressing any skepticism about her presence. She sat with all of this. She had learned to sit with uncomfortable things. And she felt it. That was the part she could not reason her way out of. She felt it. The pull of him. Not just the ritual echo she might have dismissed as magical residue, not just the confused gratitude of proximity, but something more specific and more dangerous than either of those things. She felt it when he walked into a room, the way the air changed. She felt it in the evenings when he sat across from her in that chair with his sleeves rolled up and his guards dismissed and his face wearing an expression that the entire kingdom had apparently never seen him wear before, undefended, almost open. The stoicism thinned to something more honest and far more devastating. She had started watching him the way he watched her. She noticed when he was tired, the particular set of his jaw, the way he rolled his shoulders once when he thought no one was looking. She noticed when something in the briefings had troubled him, because he would arrive at her apartments quieter than usual and sit for the first 20 minutes without asking questions, just breathing in the same space as her, as though that alone was sufficient medicine. She told herself she was observing him clinically, the way she might observe any complex, dangerous thing carefully, from a safe distance, without attachment. She did not believe herself. Chapter 9. Firelight. She felt it most on the night he stopped reaching and actually touched her. It was not dramatic. It was not a declaration. It was late, and they had been talking for hours, longer than usual, the conversation moving through territories that should have been inappropriate for their respective positions, and had long since stopped feeling that way. And she had said something that made him laugh. Actually laugh, not the controlled, social version she had heard him deploy in public, but a real one, brief and surprised and entirely unguarded. And in the aftermath of it, he had looked at her with something so unprotected in his eyes that she had stopped breathing. And he had reached across and taken her hand and held it, palm up, between both of his. Not possessively. Not claiming. Just holding. Like something he needed to be careful with. She did not pull away. They sat like that in the firelight for a long time without speaking, and the silence between them was completely different from all the silences that had come before it, warmer, more dangerous. Full of the specific weight of two people who have crossed a threshold they both know they cannot uncross. The fire burned down to coals. Neither of them moved to add wood. She was aware of every point where his hands met hers, the warmth of his palms, the careful way his thumbs traced the inside of her wrist as though reading something written there in a language he was only beginning to learn. She was aware of him breathing. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that was entirely new and entirely inconvenient. He looked up at her eventually. His eyes in the low firelight were very dark and very direct, and there was a question in them that he did not ask out loud. That he was, she understood, deliberately not asking, holding himself back from asking with the same controlled deliberateness he applied to everything. Giving her the space of it. Letting her choose whether to answer a question he hadn't voiced. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she very slowly turned her hand over in his, lacing her fingers through his fingers. He exhaled. Just once. Just slightly. The smallest release of something that had been held for a very long time. But she could feel, underneath the warmth of it, the shape of the cage. Chapter 10. A Kingdom Divided. Because every evening she could feel it, the way her movements through the palace were tracked without appearing to be tracked, the way every door was accessible to her except the ones that led outside, the way her freedom had been redesigned so artfully into comfort that it had taken her weeks to map the actual dimensions of it. She had saved him. And he had, with all the care and attentiveness and absolute authority of a king who had stopped recognizing any limit on what he needed, made that salvation into a permanent condition. His. Indefinitely. Under the guise of gratitude. She did not hate him for it. That was the most frightening part. She understood something about what the ritual had done, not just to him, but between them. Two souls that had existed in the same space at that depth did not simply separate cleanly afterward. There were filaments of connection that remained, invisible but load-bearing, and she could feel them most clearly at the moments she considered what it would mean to actually leave. Not the logistics. The feeling of it. The way even imagining it created a kind of structural ache that she had no prior framework for. She told herself it was the magic. She told herself that every morning. She believed it less every night. The kingdom outside the palace walls was not peaceful about any of this. The High Council had begun holding unofficial sessions, a thing that was technically treasonous and practically unavoidable. The bloodline purists among the nobility had moved from concerned to openly alarmed. The political stability of the entire shifter hierarchy rested on a clear, unbroken chain of legitimate succession and a king who had abandoned the traditional mating protocols in favor of an obsessive, legally unsanctioned attachment to an orphaned omega of unknown lineage was a very specific kind of threat to that stability, the kind that did not announce itself with armies, but with slow institutional erosion, the gradual delegitimization of everything the crown represented. And Aldrich knew this. He was not a stupid man. He was not even, in the deepest part of himself, an irrational one. He simply did not care. That was the thing that terrified his council most, not the attachment itself, but the king's absolute, clear-eyed, fully informed indifference to its consequences. He had looked at everything he stood to lose and had decided, with the same deliberate certainty he brought to military strategy and political governance, that he would lose all of it before he would lose her. Chapter 11. The Kingdom or Her. He had said it once, out loud, to Cassin, in a moment of uncharacteristic plainness. If the choice is the kingdom or her, he had said, with the patient, terrible calm of a man who has already made his peace with an answer that will horrify everyone around him, then the kingdom will need to find a new king. Cassin had not reported this to the council. He was afraid of what they would do with it. He was more afraid of what the king would do in response. It was not an empty declaration. That was the thing about Aldrich. He had never in his life said a thing he did not mean, and everyone who had served him long enough knew it. He did not use hyperbole. He did not make threats he wasn't prepared to carry out. When he said he would dissolve the council believed him, because he had done it before, once, 12 years ago, in a different crisis, with a different set of impossible circumstances, and he had governed alone for 8 months until he had rebuilt it on his own terms. He was capable of burning things down. He had done it before. And he had been far less motivated then than he was now. In the noble houses beyond the palace, quiet conversations were happening. Not yet conspiracy. Not quite. But the kind of measured, careful, contingency-minded talk that precedes conspiracy in the way that thunder precedes a storm, present and audible and pointing toward something that has not yet arrived. Names were being mentioned. Succession scenarios were being drafted in language deniable enough to survive scrutiny. Marriages were being quietly mooted. Plans were being drawn up for a kingdom that might, in the not-too-distant future, need to function without its current king. None of them had told him. None of them were brave enough. And all of them suspected, correctly, that he already knew. Chapter 12. The Doorway. She overheard him say it. Not to Cassin. To himself, one evening, standing at the window of her apartments looking out at the city below, unaware that she had come back early and was standing in the doorway watching him. He had not said it as a declaration. He had said it the way you say a thing you have already fully accepted, quietly, privately, the way you acknowledge something done. She stood in the doorway and looked at the breadth of his shoulders and the line of his jaw and the way he held himself even in privacy like someone accustomed to carrying weight, and she felt the full, terrible complexity of loving a cage. Because she was beginning to understand, with a clarity that arrived slowly and then all at once, that what was building between them was not just chemistry or magic or gratitude mistaken for something deeper. It was real. It was specific. It was the kind of real that had her own name for her written in it, the kind of specific that had never in her life of invisibility been aimed directly at her before. And it was housed inside something that had no door on her side. That was the wound at the center of it. Not his devotion, she could feel that devotion like sunlight through a window. Genuine and enormous, and directed entirely at her in a way that a woman who had grown up entirely unclaimed and entirely unnoticed could not absorb without it changing something fundamental in how she understood herself. The wound was the architecture surrounding it. The fact that the most profound feeling she had ever been offered had arrived inside a structure she had not chosen and could not leave. She needed him to understand the difference between choosing to stay and having no choice but to remain. She took a single step into the room. He heard it, of course he heard it. His senses were twice what any normal man's were, and she had understood for some time that he always knew exactly where she was, and he turned from the window. He looked at her standing in the doorway with that expression she had come to know. The unguarded one. The one the kingdom never saw. She held his gaze. "I want to choose," she said. Her voice was quiet and very steady. "I need you to let me choose." Something moved across his face. Something large and complicated and not entirely comfortable. He was silent for a long moment, the specific silence of a man confronting the distance between what he wants and what is right, and finding that distance considerably larger than he had allowed himself to previously measure. Whether he was capable of that understanding, whether the part of him that had grabbed her soul in the dark and had not since loosened its grip could learn to hold with an open hand rather than a closed fist. That was the question the kingdom was not asking but should have been. Because the king would burn everything down. He had said so. She believed him. The question was whether he would choose her freedom over his need. Whether devotion, when it finally understood itself fully, could become something larger than possession. And whether she, standing in that doorway watching him hold vigil at her window in the dark, watching him wrestle in real time with the thing she had asked of him, whether she already knew, in the part of herself that had been tangled with his soul since the night of the ritual, what his answer was going to be. She was still waiting. So was the kingdom. If this story already has its hooks in you, if you felt that pull in your chest during the firelight scene, or that chill when he said what he said about the kingdom, you know exactly what kind of story this is. Hit the like button right now and let me know in the comments. Do you think he can love her without caging her? Or has the soul bond already decided that for both of them? Subscribe, turn on the bell, and do not go anywhere, because this story is far from over, and the next chapter is where everything finally, inevitably, breaks wide open.